Welcome to episode 70 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, all spelled out, so SEVEN health.com/70.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another episode of Real Health Radio. It's another show where it's just me on my own, and this one is all about weight and my thoughts about weight. So if you read the mainstream media, the message that we are constantly being told is that if we care about our health, we need to be losing weight. That weight loss, in a sense, equals better health. And the argument is that weight in of itself is dangerous to our health. And if we can just remove it from the body, then longevity and decreased risk of disease will ensue. And kind of as part of this mainstream idea is the simplicity of weight loss. Like, it's just about eating less and moving more. It's about controlling cravings and having better willpower. That really is a pretty easy thing to do. And when someone isn't managing their weight, it's either that they're unaware of what foods they should be eating, and once they become aware, then it will just come off. Or if they are aware of this information, it's simply because they aren't trying hard enough. So this is probably like one end of the spectrum, and obviously it's very simplified, but that is often how it is portrayed. If we then go to the opposite end of the spectrum, the opposite line of thinking is that someone's weight has absolutely no bearing on their health whatsoever, that it is all about the habits that they keep up, that if you have two people and they are following the exact same healthy habits, one is slim, one is morbidly obese, that both of these people should have the same health outcomes because they're keeping up the same healthy habits. Or inversely, if you have two people who are following the same unhealthy habits, one of these people is slim, one of them is morbidly obese, that they will both have the same outcomes because it's all about the habits. And maybe I'm categorizing things incorrectly when I'm saying it's all about habits. There's probably things like social status and economic background, where someone lives, the kind of work they do, etc., that all of these things will impact. But it's the idea that weight in of itself is totally inert and has no bearing whatsoever on someone's health. And the people who believe that weight has no bearing on your health also assert that we have very little control or direct control over our weight, that dieting doesn't work because our body has its own set point and it will fight back, and maybe we can change it temporarily, but over the long haul it will do what it wants to do irrespective of your wishes. So if I'm creating a spectrum, these two positions I've just described are probably sitting towards the ends of both of them. There's probably like positions that are even more militant or more extreme at both ends that take this even further. But the explanations I've given probably bookend the two positions at either end of the spectrum. And then you have everything in between. So what I want to do today as part of the show is look at a lot of the ideas relating to weight. It is a topic I've touched on a lot of times before in podcasts, probably most prominently in a podcast they did on my overeating experiment. For anyone who is interested in that episode, you can find it at www.7-health.com/38. From about the 47-minute mark onwards is when I start talking about weight, and I cover it to the end of the show, which is 2 hours, 15 minutes. So there's a long time that I spend dedicated to the topic of weight. And I'm going to not try and go through the same information that I went through as part of that podcast. There'll probably be a little bit of overlap, but I don't want it to just be a repetition of those ideas. So if you want to hear more on that side of things and what I went through in that podcast, then I recommend checking it out. It is actually the podcast that has been the most downloaded, the most listened to. So it's a very good episode. But talking about weight and what I'm going to cover today is something that I've wanted to do for a while, and I want to have a show where I just kind of lay out my thoughts on the topic, and maybe these thoughts will change over time, and I'm undoubtedly that will be the case because I'm constantly updating how I think about things and my beliefs, etc. But this at least shows you where I'm standing at the moment and where I think things are. And this show may not be as cohesive as some of the other episodes. It's not going to be as structured. It might be a little bit more of a stream of consciousness, but it's just a collection of ideas. And for a lot of this stuff, I want to say that I don't have complete answers, and I don't know what the solution is or what the set in stone answer is, but it's what, as I said, I currently believe based on my own research, based on the books that I've read, based on what I've seen from working with clients in practice. So I guess let me just start with stating my beliefs about weight, and then I can expand on this and touch on different issues as we go on. So I think that someone's weight, and this is weight in of itself, can have an impact on someone's health. I don't think that carrying higher and higher amounts of body fat is completely inert, and that fat can cause some consequences. And I also think the same is true in the opposite direction. Carrying less and less body fat can be problematic. When you get to levels that are too low, that the body notices there's those lack of fat stores, and that in of itself, that carrying too low amount of fat can cause a problem. So I don't believe that it's only about diet and lifestyle and other factors, that the level of fat that someone is carrying or is not carrying can have an impact on them. But with this in mind, I want to make a couple of points with this. And first is that someone's weight by itself is only a small, if not tiny factor for most people. So the difference for someone going from a BMI of say 27 down to a BMI of 24 is probably going to make a pretty tiny difference to someone's health outcomes. Now, someone could have huge changes in their health as part of this process because they change their exercise habits, or they change their eating habits, or they get out of a terrible relationship, or they start sleeping more. But these are things that make the majority of difference. It's not the weight. And if someone made all these changes but stayed at a BMI of 27 the same way, the place where they started, they would see almost identical health improvements for the someone who went from a BMI of 27 down to 24. And this is important because so many of the people who are routinely told by doctors or other health professionals that they should lose weight are going to see very little benefit just from losing the weight. They'll benefit from other food or lifestyle changes, but this isn't because of the weight. But so often when people talk about weight, it's like it's the only thing that matters for our health. That if you're not losing the weight, then everything else that you're doing is inconsequential. Or that if you are losing all the weight, that is the only thing that matters. And what I would suggest that weight can be a factor, but it is only one of the factors. And for a lot of people, it's a factor that matters very little. And like if I'm putting together a list of factors off, say, the top of my head that I think are going to be important for health outside of just weight, it would include eating more fruits and vegetables, eating a largely whole food diet, having consistent eating habits, not smoking, moderate alcohol consumption, regular and consistent movement patterns or exercise that is appropriate for that person's body, getting good quality restorative sleep each night, which should be for most people somewhere around 7 to 9 hours, feeling autonomy in someone's life, having lack of oppression, ability to handle and express emotions and having really constructive coping skills, relaxation and unwinding being a daily practice and part of someone's life, having solid relationships with family and friends, ideally maybe having a strong sense of community, spending time outdoors, getting regular sunlight, being in nature, a sense of purpose, an ability to spend your time doing the things in your life that you find meaningful. Like, this list is by no means exhaustive, but all of these factors have a huge impact on your health, and these are irrespective of your weight. So if we were instead encouraging these practices, instead of just myopically focusing on people losing weight, people's health outcomes would drastically improve. And there's a great TED Talk by Sandra Amadotz. I'm maybe pronouncing her surname incorrectly. It's Aamodts. And I'm going to link to it in the show notes. And she, as part of this talk, and she covers it in her book, Why Diets Make Us Fat. I haven't read the book. I've only seen her TED Talk. But as part of it, she shows data about how habits and weight intersect to impact on health. And what she shows is that if you have people who are following unhealthy habits, so say they smoke, they don't exercise, they eat none or very little fruits and vegetables, they drink more than they should in terms of alcohol. In a situation like this, carrying extra weight has a bigger negative impact. So if you take someone who is a normal BMI, and again, I'm using the normal in terms of what the BMI scale is. If you take someone with a normal BMI who is following these unhealthy habits, and then you look at someone who is obese and is then following these unhealthy habits, the relative risk of death or relative risk of disease for the heavier person is greater. And it's like this extra weight magnifies these unhealthy habits and makes them worse for someone who is heavier versus someone who is less heavy. But if you then have people who are following healthy habits, the results then change. And in her example, this meant doing exercise or regular exercise or movement, having fruits and vegetables, not smoking, drinking moderately. When you have people doing this and keeping up consistently, the relative risk of death for both normal weight person and an obese person is basically identical. And maybe the weight or maybe as the weight gets higher, this will change. So I don't know what the cutoff point was as part of this study or the studies that she looked at as part of this data. So I don't know what the highest BMI was for the obese group and what would happen if it was taken up another 5 or a 10 or 15 points. So I don't know if this holds true across all weight spectrums. But what I would imagine is that even if the relative risk is higher, once that weight does get higher, it's going to be nowhere near as high as someone who isn't following these habits. And it's the habits that people keep up that really account for the bulk of the improvements that these people notice. And I also believe, and this is backed up by research, is that we don't have absolute control over our weight, especially over the long term. Of course, there are factors that make it more or less likely that someone is going to be heavier or they're going to be lighter, but a lot of this just isn't down to us and how that pans out. So we all know people who can eat junk food all their life and they drink excessive amounts of alcohol, but they are incredibly thin. Just as we know people who are very careful with their eating and have very small portions, but have much more of a propensity to put on weight irrespective of what they eat. And this was kind of the reason that I did the overeating experiment that I talked about at the top of the show that I did at the start of this year. Like, I wanted to show that despite eating a huge amount of food, I have a propensity to resist weight gain. And I saw very little change despite the fact that I ate, I think it was something like an extra 35,000 calories on top of what my body supposedly needs over a 9-week period. It made very little change to my weight. And there are people who are much heavier than where they would ordinarily be if they weren't following poor eating habits, if they weren't kind of not doing exercise, and a myriad of sort of other lifestyle factors. Just as there are people who are sitting at a weight that is much lighter than is healthy for them and for their body type, and they're managing this through restriction and overtraining and disordered food behaviors. And I think as a society, we have a very skewed perspective of what a healthy body should look like, and that this is much broader in range than is what is typically presented to us. And typically, just looking at someone isn't a good indication of health, because there are plenty of thin and attractive people who are in terrible health. Just so there are plenty of people walking around in bodies that don't match up to our perceived visual appearance of health, yet they are very healthy. And so while I do think that we have some influence over our weight and that the weight that we sit at can impact on our health, we don't have absolute control over what the number on the scale says, especially over the long term. And whatever the number says, this doesn't determine how healthy or unhealthy we are. And One of the confusions that people often have when they hear that weight isn't as important to health as we're originally told is they believe that this message is then just suggesting that people should sit on the couch, they should eat junk food, they should never do exercise because weight doesn't matter. And this is definitely not the message. I'm not encouraging people to do this. I'm encouraging people to follow practices that are healthful and that support their body. I want people to get to a place where the majority of the food that they eat is whole foods. It might take a while to get to that place, but they find that that's where they end up. I want people to find ways that they like moving their body and that they enjoy it. Again, this could take time, but it's where I want them to end up. And they discover coping skills and managing stress and like the long list of other things that are supportive for health. What I'm advocating is for people to do all of these things, but when this is happening, they aren't then just using weight as the yardstick of whether or not this stuff is working. Because sometimes it will lead to weight loss, but other times it won't. And what I see then happening when it doesn't is people stopping doing these habits because they deem it's not working for them. Or instead they start restricting or over-exercising or doing unhealthy behaviors just so they can get the number on the scale to move. Behaviors that in the long run lead to worse health despite the fact that their weight has now come down. And this is why the weight loss message for me can be so damaging. And it's not because everyone who loses weight is unhealthy, but it's because we start to see things in a very simplistic terms where we aren't looking at the bigger picture and we just arrive at that equation of less weight equals more health. And this equation definitely doesn't hold true all of the time and even the majority of the time because of the things that people are doing to actually get there. And really, whether or not you agree with me about the health implications of someone's weight or how important or unimportant it is, I think no one should be discriminated because of their weight. And there was a recent article that I posted on my Facebook page about a policy change in the UK that from January 2017, in certain parts in the UK, those who are obese or who smoke will have their surgeries delayed. And the restrictions means that if someone is overweight, the patient will have to lose 10% of their weight before they can get surgery. If they are a smoker, they're going to face a 6-month delay before they get surgery. And this to me is just flat out discrimination. And I don't either think that it will lead to the improvements in health outcomes that people think it is going to. If someone is a smoker and they face delays in surgery, I imagine that people will just start lying about the fact of their smoking habits. Perhaps some will quit because of it, but the majority of people will just follow the path of least resistance and will just instead tell the NHS, which is our healthcare service, that they've stopped smoking so they can get the surgery. For those who are obese, it's not so easy. So if they are weighed in the doctor's office, then there is going to be a record of that weight. So there's probably no lying that they can do to get around this. Now, if someone has the ultimatum that they need to lose weight to get surgery, what is the most likely thing they're going to do? They're going to go on some kind of crash diet to try and make it happen. So that even if they are able to lose the weight in the short term and get the surgery, long term they're probably going to end up back at the same weight that they were, if not higher, because that's the nature of dieting. And the thing that people forget is it's not like these people aren't already trying to lose weight. The vast majority of these people are going to be constantly dieting and trying to lose weight and going on and off diets. If you have health issues and you're regularly seeing your doctor, you've probably been told countless times to lose weight. So it's not like these people aren't already trying to do this. And I think that it's also very arbitrary that they've picked weight and smoking as measures of whether or not to restrict someone's access to surgery. There are lots of things that we know can be damaging of health. Why are we just picking weight and smoking? Like excessive alcohol intake has disastrous impacts on someone's health. Why aren't we forcing people to stop doing this before surgery? Inadequate sleep is associated with poor health outcomes like across the board. Why aren't we asking if people are getting 8 hours of sleep a night, and if they're not sleeping through the night and they're not getting adequate sleep, why aren't we blocking surgery for this happening? Or why aren't we finding out if someone is anyway responsible for the surgery they're needing? the implication is always that when a person is obese, it's 100% their fault, and so they then don't deserve the surgery. So if someone is in a car accident and it was because they were speeding, why don't we deny them surgery? Because it's their own fault. If you go on a skiing holiday and you injure yourself, obviously you know skiing is a dangerous sport, so why should we, the taxpayer, foot the bill for you doing something stupid? We know people living in poverty increase the incidence of pretty much all diseases and lead to early death because of it. If we look at poverty in the same simplified manner as we do with being overweight, then being poor is a choice. You just need to work harder, to be more entrepreneurial, to invest more wisely. Why don't you kind of block the surgery unless homeless incomes reach, or household income, reach a certain income level to give poor people the impetus that they need to earn more, because otherwise they're just going to stay lazy and they're going to be a drain on the system. And I could go on, but I hope you're getting the point and the fact that I'm speaking a particular way around this. In lots of people's minds, they associate smoking and being overweight with being unhealthy. And so maybe blocking surgery seems like the wake-up call that these people need. But for me, I know this measure is going to do very little to change these health problems and to change these health outcomes. But what it is doing is it is just discriminating against these people, and it's disguised then as a health concern. And one thing that I should mention is that people need to also be aware of their own biases and assumptions around this stuff. And everyone has them, even those who claim that they don't. And I know that I definitely have biases with this stuff, knowing that I've had difficulty always putting on weight, and no matter how much I eat, it doesn't change anything, gives me a bias that when I think about other people who struggle, I think that maybe they're in the same position that I am. So I know that there are biases, and I know that I have biases when I read research and all of those things. And I think that we need to be keeping this in mind, because when people have certain biases, the way that they interpret certain research, what they think is valid and what they disagree with, is going to be impacted on that. And I see this perfectly if you think about veganism versus the paleo movement. So some new piece of research comes out that says eating meat leads to an increased rate of cancer. Those in the vegan community, they then share the article around saying, see, this is why we don't eat meat. Here's even more evidence to back up why we follow this approach. And then the paleo community, they come out, they pick apart the research, analyzing it under a fine-tooth comb and explaining why all the ways the study is incomplete or flawed or why it's been analyzed wrong. And then you have the same thing happen when the opposite bit of research comes out showing the problems with a vegan diet. And the same thing happens. The paleo community, they champion it. The vegan community pulls it apart and explains why it's all wrong. Or earlier this year, there was a vegan climber who died while attempting to climb Mount Everest. And many people with very little facts had the audacity to say that it was because they were following, or she was following, a vegan diet. And people were actually joking about this and kind of saying it served her right for being a vegan and attempting to climb Mount Everest, and she got what she deserved. Completely horrible stuff. And imagine how different it would have been if this person who died had been following a paleo diet, and how this would have been affected by the way that these people talked about something that is a genuine tragedy. People need to be open-minded and be aware of their biases when looking at research and what they choose to read. And personally, I try and read as widely as I can. And I read people who I feel are very good researchers and scientists, but have very different opinions to me. And I want to read why they say what they say and see how this affects my own beliefs. And with research on weight, what I want people to think about is also when something shows that being heavier is associated with worse health outcomes, I think we need to start to look deeper into this stuff and ask, is this because of the actual weight, or is it due to other factors that are associated with this weight? And what I mean by this is, let me give a couple of examples. So those who are heavier tend to suffer more discrimination because of their weight. And this discrimination could lead to higher amounts of stress hormones in the body. This could lead to more inflammation. And if we alternatively lived in a society that didn't champion thinness and dieting the way that it does, they wouldn't suffer this discrimination, and then the snowball effects that this can change in terms of physiology. So maybe it's not that this person is heavier and that weight in of itself is causing a problem, but it's the discrimination that they then suffer because of that weight and the anxiety and the worry, etc. Those who are heavier may have suffered more trauma than others. And this won't be for everyone, but as a percentage, it could be that it's more common in the population that is heavier than in those who are thinner. So there is a study called the CDC Kaiser-Permanente Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it's actually a study I'm going to do a whole podcast on at some point. But it was originally meant to be a weight loss study done in the 1980s. And what they found as part of the weight loss study is there was a real dropout rate of about 50%. So these people, they would be told what they need to do, the weight's coming off, they're starting to then notice a dropout. What was interesting was that the people who were dropping out were the ones that were actually losing the weight. So it wasn't the people who were really struggling, it wasn't budging, and so they're dropping out. It was the people who were actually seeing the benefits or being successful, in inverted commas. So they called these people back and they started to ask them more questions about what was going on. And what they found was that a large amount of those that had dropped out had actually experienced sexual abuse as a child. And the findings suggested that the weight gain had been a coping mechanism for, say, depression or anxiety and fear, and now that weight was coming off, all of those issues were now getting worse. So they then decided to expand the survey out and include more people and looking at a wider range of childhood trauma. And what they found was that the more trauma that someone had had in childhood, the more likely it was that they were going to suffer with smoking, with alcohol and drug abuse, with obesity, and then a wide range of health conditions. I am by no means saying that everyone who is sitting at a heavier weight is doing so because of abuse or adverse childhood experience, etc. But if abuse is more likely to lead to weight gain, then the health outcomes that we are associating with the weight may have a lot less to do with the weight, or very little to do with the weight, or nothing to do with the weight, and a lot more to do with the repercussions of trauma that this person has experienced. And there really is just lots of other examples like this where we have to ask ourselves, is it the weight per se, or is it just the weight or what's associated with that weight that has caused the issue? So being exposed to high amounts of environmental pollutants or chemicals can lead to weight gain. So is it the weight that's the issue, or is it the chemicals and the pollutants? Poverty is associated with higher weights, and some of this is down to eating more processed food that is highly palatable, but a lot of it is due to lack of autonomy, the increased stress, the lack of downtime and play, etc. So again, is it really the weight, or is it all of these other factors? And the opposite could also be very true when we look at thinness. So maybe it's not the thinner or the lower weight that is so beneficial as much as the other factors that are then associated with that weight. So more often that someone who is thinner is not had the experience of being in poverty, or they haven't suffered the discrimination, or they haven't had the adverse childhood experiences. And this may mean that living in that thinner body, it's not the thinner body that's so helpful for health, it's all of the other stuff that they've not had to experience or they've missed out on because of that. And with all of these comments, I'm not claiming that this makes the weight totally irrelevant. Maybe these situations explain the majority of the health differences. Maybe they only explain part of it, and the weight is important. All I'm saying is this stuff is by no means as straightforward and as simplistic as it's made out, and just telling someone that they need to lose weight is not really a great solution. One thing I would also say, or another thing I'd also say is, it's very easy to create false dichotomies where you either believe it's health at every size or you are part of the weight loss industry. But it's not really as straightforward as this. And things are a lot more grey instead of the black and white. And I do think it's okay to agree with ideas on one side of the aisle and ideas on the other side of the aisle and say, yes, I agree with this, but I agree with it up until a point, and these are why, or this is where I have more difficulty, or this is where I see it being more of a problem. And everyone accuses the other side of cherry picking the data. And while this definitely does happen, so many of the people who are accusing others of cherry picking the data are doing the same thing themselves. And I find that this throwaway comment of you are picking or cherry picking the data is just a very easy way of discrediting the other person and very easy way of explaining away why they've come to the conclusions that they have. And I think we need to be, this is another idea, careful with how much we want to ignore someone's weight from a medical perspective. Like, obviously we don't want to be lecturing someone about their weight, but someone's weight can be a symptom of other conditions that are happening. And we want to keep this in mind. And I do think that this can be a problem where people start to say, like, totally forget about weight. We should never think about or mention weight. It should just be thought about as totally inert. It can often be a key into something else that's going on. So if someone's had sudden unexplained weight gain, just the same way as they've had sudden unexplained weight loss, this should be investigated. The weight should be seen more as a symptom as opposed to the problem, but I think it can be something it's like, maybe we should look into this. Like, if someone has unexplained weight loss, the solution isn't just getting them to eat continuously until they regain the weight. It's looking at what's the underlying reason that this has occurred. So maybe through doing some testing, it turns out this person has leukemia or a lymphoma, and the cure for this isn't getting the person to just put weight back on. It's making the diagnosis and then following whatever treatment or protocol is then appropriate for that condition. And the same thing with weight gain. Like, just like weight loss, there can be many reasons why this happens, and there should be some investigation to see why this is happening. Are there disease processes or pathological changes that are occurring in the body that is leading to this? Because if there is, these aren't going to be remedied just by someone losing weight, and telling them to go on a diet is going to do very little. If the driver for someone's weight gain is actually hypothyroidism or PCOS or Cushing syndrome or a long list of other medical conditions that is causing that weight gain, or even if it isn't a medical condition, but they're just under an inordinate amount of stress, and from a physiological perspective, the body is changing and it's prioritizing weight gain as opposed to using that energy that is coming in straight away. Getting someone to go on a diet and just trying to actively lose weight isn't looking at the real reason for why this is going on. And I would add, like, there are certain types of people where changes in their habits are more likely to cause weight loss. And in the last podcast I did, I spoke to Joe Bernstein, and he was someone who lost over 160 pounds. Previously, he'd lived off a fast food diet and lots of microwave meals. He'd done some exercise while he was at school, but afterwards he really hadn't been doing any exercise. He switched from this kind of eating and living to then cooking his own food, eating lots more whole foods, got a dog, he was moving every day. And it wasn't just the food and exercise side of things. He also did a lot of work on his thoughts and his beliefs, and he started living life in a passion-filled way. And someone like this is probably the most likely person who is going to lose weight through lifestyle changes and through making changes in who they are. And there's obviously no guarantees, but this would be the kind of person who, if I was going to bet on it, they'd be the person who it's most likely going to happen for. But if someone has always been heavier, but they've played lots of sports and they've eaten healthy whole food diets, and the chances of them then changing their diet and losing a lot of weight and doing it in a healthy way, it's just a lot less likely. Yes, they can go on a diet, and yes, they could lose weight in the short term, but it's less likely that this is going to stay off long term. And if someone has a poor relationship with food and they do lots of, say, comfort eating or binge eating, then maybe this is pushing their intake higher than it ordinarily would be. And there's probably going to be episodes of restriction prior to this, and maybe the calories are then balancing themselves out, or maybe they are higher overall than they would be. So if this person then deals with their issues around food and becomes more of a normal eater in inverted commas, maybe in the long term this does lead to weight loss, but maybe it doesn't. And there just really aren't any guarantees with this stuff. And there are scenarios where it's more or less likely to happen, but what actually does happen is so much more down to your body and your physiology rather than just your willpower. And weight can be an issue when someone is sitting at a weight that is unnatural for their body, but this can happen at different points along the spectrum. So if someone is dieting and they're restricting and they're over-exercising and a long list of other things that are unnaturally bringing their weight to a lower place than it would be ideally, this can then be creating a problem. And as an outsider, you could be looking at this person and they be what society deems as skinny. They could be normal, they could be overweight, they could be obese, but regardless of how you see them or how society sees them, their body registers that because of what they're doing and where their weight is currently sitting, that it is at a lower place than where that body wants it to be. And the body, in a sense, thinks that it is in a famine, or it thinks that it needs to hold on to things. So regardless of how that person looks on the outside and how you would judge them or believe they to be, their body has a very different opinion of things. And when the body thinks that it is in a famine, or when the body thinks it's not got enough coming in because of over-exercise or under-eating, it changes how it behaves, and this can lead to symptoms. So digestion gets slowed down and they become impaired, and people get lots of issues with that. Sleep can become interrupted. Menstrual cycle for women can become erratic or stop, and in both men and women, libido can be reduced. So health is affected because this person is maintaining a weight that the body feels is unnaturally low for them. And the same is then also true with weight being on the heavier side. There are some people who are naturally heavier, and this weight happens while eating and living in a healthy way. But there are then others where weight is sitting at an inordinately high place than it would be if they were following healthier habits and they were keeping this up. And there was a recent podcast done by Chris Sandel called When Fat People Can't Get Fat Enough and Lean People Get Fat in All the Wrong Places. And what he talks about as part of that show is often the problems associated with being fat isn't the fatness per se, but it's actually when the body reaches a point where it can no longer get fatter. And when this starts to happen, more of the fat starts going into the liver and to other places, and this starts to create problems, especially with liver function. So it impacts on the liver's ability to store glycogen, and so glycogen is the form of energy that we use between meals. It also affects the liver's ability to function properly, like just across the board. So whether we're talking about detoxification or energy management or really any system that the liver is involved in. So if someone is getting fatter and the adipose tissue is taking in that fat and it's then getting the things that it needs to be able to expand and getting new blood vessels and oxygen supply and nutrients to these areas, then it's able to continue to expand. And this isn't to say that this person has to get bigger or they should intentionally be trying to get bigger, but it is that the body is able to deal with this as it continues on. But when this stops happening and more of the fat starts getting shuttled from that adipose tissue and is making its way into the liver and other parts of the body, this is when it starts to become a problem. So this again then starts to come back to habits that people are keeping up. Like all of these other factors that I mentioned previously around like fruits and vegetables and regular movement and managing stress and healthy relationships, etc. If people are doing these things, then the body is able to healthily function despite how the society may deem their weight or the weight that they're sitting at. But as more and more unhealthy habits ensue, this can then lead to the body being unable to deal with this increased weight and then the fat spilling out into the liver and other parts of the body outside of that adipose tissue and causing a problem. And this can happen at lots of different weight ranges. So you can have someone who is, for all intensive purposes, looking quite thin, where this is a problem for them. And you can then have someone who is at a much, much heavier weight where there isn't a problem in terms of that. So I'm going to put a note to or a link to the show notes for the Chris Masterjohn podcast if anyone wants to check it out. It's pretty science heavy, so it's definitely not going to be for everyone. Chris is also an advocate of people actually focusing on body composition, and he talks about that in the podcast of when it's the right time to do that. And so I don't necessarily agree with him on all matters, but I think he has a fantastic way of explaining the science behind the physiology's things, or the physiology of how the body works with this. So this brings the episode to a close, and as I said, it's been a little bit less structured than normally. It's been a little bit more of a stream of consciousness, but I do hope that you found it useful. I guess maybe in summary, I don't believe that body weight is completely irrelevant and that fat or lack of it doesn't have an impact on its health. I think it does, but I feel that for the majority of people, that weight is much more of a minor issue than it is made out to be, and that food and lifestyle factors and mental emotional issues matter much, much more than the number on the scale. And if someone wants to try and lose weight, then that is their own decision, and by all means they can do that. But what I would suggest that make sure that when you're doing that, you are not losing your health at the same time, that you are doing things that are sustainable, or at least you're making changes that mean that weight loss is sustainable, and you're not putting your life on hold for this to happen. So it's not that you're telling yourself that I will be happier, I will be more confident when I weigh X number of pounds. And ironically, the people who are most successful with this kind of thing, with a long-term weight loss, and by successful I mean that they keep it off and they do it relatively easy without it compromising their health, are those who make changes in a way that they enjoy their new way of eating and living, and actually the weight comes off as a side effect as opposed to being the ultimate goal. And this kind of weight loss, it won't happen for everyone, but it is the thing that underpins those who I've spoken to or worked with or read about who seem to have lost weight and had it kept off long term and kept their health and sanity intact. So that is it. Next week, I will be back with another guest. By that stage, I will be on holidays in Thailand, so hopefully I'll be lying by a pool or on a beach, but I will have internet connection and I'll have the show uploaded. So enjoy your week, and I will catch up with you soon.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.